On a Monday morning in August of 1917, 19-year-old Molly Maggia and her older sister, Albina, walked to their new jobs in the small city of Orange, New Jersey. Molly and Albina didn't really look like sisters. Molly was tall and had smooth brown hair, while Albina was an entire foot shorter and kept her own brown curls covered with a hat. But that morning, they had something in common. They were both so excited for work that they were practically bouncing along the sidewalk. A few weeks earlier, Molly and her sister had seen an advertisement for jobs at a local studio, where employees helped create one of the most fashionable items of the era: watches that glowed in the dark. This particular advertisement was looking for women who could hand paint the tiny glow-in-the-dark numbers and hands on the watch faces. And this was really exciting for Molly and Albina, because there weren't many job opportunities out there for women. At the time, women typically got stuck working in dangerous factories for extremely low wages. But this job was different. It seemed interesting and artistic, and it paid really well. Plus, it sounded glamorous, because they wouldn't have to work in a dirty factory. Instead, they'd work in a clean, well-maintained studio. Molly knew that lots of women wanted these positions, but she and her sister applied anyway, and amazingly, they both got hired. Molly was ecstatic. Not only had she landed this amazing job, but she got to go to work every day with her big sister. She'd been looking forward to their first day at work ever since. Molly turned a corner and saw the studio building. The sisters walked up and knocked on the door, and a few seconds later, a middle-aged woman wearing a plaid dress answered. She introduced herself as the studio's forewoman and led them inside. And when Molly walked into this building, she was amazed by what she saw. Dozens of these women were sitting in rows, paintbrushes in hand, dipping them into this glowing powder and then applying them to the watch face over and over and over again. They were working so quickly, it was like their hands were this glowing blur. The more Molly watched, the more excited she was to be one of these women. However, just then, the forewoman told Molly and her sister that they wouldn't actually be painting that day. Before they ever touched a brush, they had to learn what a well-painted watch looked like. The forewoman led Molly and her sister past the sparkling painters and into a totally different room. There, Molly saw a handful of young women inspecting watch faces that had already been painted. Now, Molly was not very excited about doing quality control, but she knew this was a necessary step towards becoming a full-time watch painter. The forewoman introduced Molly and her sister to the inspector who'd be training them. Her name was Catherine Schaub. The forewoman explained that Catherine was just 15 years old and had only been working at the studio for about 6 months. However, in that time, she'd worked her way up from being an apprentice to a painter and now an instructor. The forewoman told Molly and her sister that they too could be like Catherine if they worked hard enough. Then she left and headed back out to the main studio. After she was gone, Catherine began showing Molly and Albina the ropes. Molly watched as Catherine spread a few circular paper watch faces out on the table. Catherine explained that each watch face was pre-printed, so the paper was black and the numbers were white. Painters would then go over the white numbers with the glow-in-the-dark paint. But it was really important that none of the paint went outside the lines. Otherwise, the whole thing would have to be thrown out. And so for the next several days, Molly and her sister inspected watch faces, and Catherine would then check their work. Once they'd both gotten the hang of spotting imperfections, Catherine told them it was time to learn how to paint. This was what Molly had been waiting for. She was so excited. She watched as Catherine demonstrated how to mix water and glue together to create the liquid base for the paint. She explained that they would dip their brushes into the liquid, then into the glow-in-the-dark powder, and then use that to paint. Next, Catherine showed Molly and her sister the paintbrushes they'd be using, and Molly couldn't believe how tiny they were. Each one was made out of wood and camel hair. The handle was incredibly thin, and the brush itself was made of just 30 hairs. However, Catherine warned them that even though the brush appeared to look very sharp, the bristles often would spread the more it was used, causing the paint to kind of go outside of the lines. And so Catherine told them to always make sure they kept the tip of their brush very sharp before making a stroke. Molly nodded, grabbed a paintbrush, and started practicing. A few weeks later, Molly sat down amongst the rows of women in the main studio, painting one watch face after another. While her sister Albina was still struggling to get the hang of painting, Molly had quickly proven that she was a natural artist and had been promoted to full-time painter very quickly. She would get paid for every watch face that she completed without error, so she made sure to work really fast. Molly was so good at her job that she could actually paint and socialize at the same time without slowing down at all. So, as she painted that day, she also gossiped and cracked jokes with the young woman who sat across from her, whose name was Ella Eckert. Molly had actually been kind of intimidated by her when they first met, but now they were like best friends. And so as Molly slid a finished watch face to the side and grabbed a new one, Ella leaned across the table and said she wanted to show her something. Molly watched as Ella dipped her paintbrush into the glow-in-the-dark powder, but then instead of painting a watch, she began painting her own fingernails. Ella painted each nail on her right hand, and then held up her hand and wiggled her fingers to show Molly. Even in the brightly lit studio, Ella's fingernails glowed beautifully. It was like the most amazing, expensive-looking nail polish Molly had ever seen. So Molly started painting her nails too, and the next thing she knew, other women in the studio were doing the same thing. Four years later, in 1921, Molly showed up for another day of painting watches at the studio. And she felt especially lucky to be there because over the past 4 years, this company she worked for had changed hands and downsized. And so a lot of women were laid off, and some had to quit to find other work, including her sister Albina. Because Molly was one of the very best painters there, she'd managed to keep her job. That day, after walking into the main studio, Molly waved at a few coworkers and smiled, and then sat down and got to work. The repetitive movement of dipping the brush in the powder and then painting the watch over and over and over again was sort of like meditation. Molly kind of zoned out as she did it. But on this day, she suddenly felt this sharp pain inside of her mouth. Molly winced. She'd had a tooth pulled a few weeks ago after getting a really bad toothache, and the spot where it used to be had not healed well. She kept accidentally pressing on it with her tongue and making it hurt even worse. Molly shook off this new pain and went back to work. She painted a big stack of watch faces and then stood up to bring them to the studio's forewoman. But as she was walking over, her tongue flicked back to the sore spot on her gums, and she winced again. Molly knew she was making the pain worse, but she couldn't stop herself from messing with the sore. It should have healed by now, which made her think that maybe the dentist didn't know what he was doing. She told herself that if this sore did not get any better, she would have to go see a different dentist. A month later, in October of 1921, the sore in Molly's mouth was still there, so she did go and find a new dentist. She walked into his office, and she met this tall, middle-aged man with big glasses. He introduced himself as Dr. Joseph Neff, then led her back to an exam room and asked what had brought her in that day. Molly explained that about 2 months ago, she'd gotten a toothache and had one tooth removed, but her gums never healed, and ever since, the pain in her mouth had only gotten worse. It had spread all the way across her gums and into her lower jaw. Molly told Dr. Neff that she suspected her first dentist had actually done something wrong to cause all of this pain, and so she was really hoping that he, this new dentist, would be able to fix that. Dr. Neff nodded, then leaned Molly back and asked her to open up her mouth. He used a metal tool to prod at her teeth, and after only a few moments, he told Molly that her gums looked very swollen and several of her teeth were loose. Molly was immediately terrified and said she didn't want to lose any more teeth, but Dr. Neff assured her that would not happen. He said her pain had nothing to do with the first dentist that she saw. Instead, she had a common condition called periodontitis, which is a gum disease caused by bacteria. As soon as they got the bacteria out of her mouth, her gums would heal, and she would feel much better. So Dr. Neff gave Molly a special antibacterial mouthwash, and then she was on her way feeling very optimistic. A few weeks later, in November, Molly sat in the main studio painting and tried to focus on her work. A few of her coworkers were gossiping and laughing beside her, but Molly was in so much pain that nothing felt funny to her anymore. She didn't even want to open her mouth to laugh, because then everyone would see that she was missing multiple teeth. Her smile, which she used to think was one of her best features, was now full of holes. Dr. Neff had promised her that she would not lose any more teeth, but that had not been true. Even though Molly had been using the antibacterial mouthwash exactly as instructed, her condition only got worse. Her gums continued swelling and her teeth got looser and looser until eventually they just started falling out. And every time Molly lost a tooth, a painful ulcer formed where the tooth used to be, so her gums were extremely swollen, all of her teeth were either loose or missing, and her mouth was full of these horrible, painful sores. Molly had been back to Dr. Neff's office multiple times, but all he'd been able to do was prescribe painkillers. He couldn't actually figure out what was happening to her teeth, let alone figure out how to stop it. And as if the situation wasn't bad enough, over the last few days, Molly had noticed that her breath smelled horrible. No matter how many times she brushed her teeth or used mouthwash, the smell just would not go away. Molly didn't know what to do. She used to feel totally at home in the watch painting studio, but now she felt totally alone. The next day, Dr. Neff was at his dental office when he heard the front door open. He looked over and saw Molly, and she looked like she'd been crying. She told him that she was in so much pain that she'd had to quit her job. She really just needed to know what was going on with her. Dr. Neff quickly ushered her back to an exam room, leaned her back in a chair, and took a look at her few remaining teeth. And almost immediately, he noticed the awful smell coming out of Molly's mouth. As a dental professional, Dr. Neff actually recognized this scent. It was not typical bad breath. It was the smell of Molly's teeth rotting inside of her mouth. By this point, Dr. Neff knew his original diagnosis of a bacterial infection just had to be wrong. He thought over all of Molly's symptoms: swollen gums, painful ulcers that wouldn't heal, and now rotting teeth. And at first, he just couldn't make sense of them all. But then, Dr. Neff had an idea. To him, Molly's symptoms seemed very similar to a condition dentists sometimes called phossy jaw, which caused swelling, sores, toothaches, and the gradual death of the teeth and jawbones. Phossy was short for phosphorus, and the condition was caused by phosphorus poisoning. It was most common amongst people who worked in factories that manufactured products using phosphorus, like matches. So Dr. Neff asked Molly what she did for work. She explained to him that she used to be a watch painter before she'd had to quit. Dr. Neff asked her if the paint that they were using contained phosphorus, and Molly said she had no idea. Dr. Neff explained his theory to Molly and then told her he would go over to the watch studio himself to follow up. So after their appointment was over, he went to the studio and actually spoke to the forewoman, and she would tell the dentist there was definitely no phosphorus in the paint. Dr. Neff sighed. He was back at square one. About 6 months later, in May of 1922, Dr. Neff led Molly to an exam room for yet another dental appointment. He still had not been able to determine what was wrong with her, but every time she came into his office, she looked worse than before. That day, Molly limped towards the exam chair and slowly lowered herself into the seat. She said another doctor had diagnosed her with rheumatism in her hips and feet, which basically meant that her bones and joints ached all the time. Dr. Neff looked at Molly. She was only 24 years old, but it was like her whole body was disintegrating. He didn't know what to say, but he still held on to hope that he might be able to diagnose and treat her. So he leaned Molly back in the chair and asked her to open up her mouth. But when she did, she immediately winced and pointed at her jaw. Dr. Neff used his fingers to feel around her cheek and jawbone on the outside, but despite how gentle he was being, he literally heard her jawbone crack. When he reached into her mouth, he literally picked up a chunk of her lower jaw and pulled it right out. Dr. Neff was so shocked he was just frozen for a moment, holding Molly's broken bone in his hand. She looked at him, clearly afraid, confused, and in horrible pain. But all Dr. Neff could do was give her more pain medication and tell her, "Come back if anything changes." And a week later, Molly did come back. She told Dr. Neff the pain in her jaw was absolutely unbearable, even with the pain medication. And so once again, Dr. Neff reached into her mouth to examine her, except this time, what was left of her lower jaw just disintegrated into his hands. Dr. Neff was horrified. Whatever was wrong with Molly, he didn't know if it was something he could even fix, and so he arranged to have her sent straight to the hospital. A month later, in June, Dr. Neff was back at his office doing what he did a lot these days, thinking about Molly. He knew hospital doctors had done their best to fix and stitch up her face, but Molly was now left so disfigured because of her jaw disintegrating that she rarely left her apartment anymore, because people would just stare and point at her. On top of that, Dr. Neff knew that Molly was still in constant, debilitating pain, no matter what pain meds she was on. Dr. Neff knew he couldn't give Molly her job back, but he kept thinking that if he could just come up with a diagnosis, he might at least be able to lessen her pain. So he thought about her symptoms, her job, her lifestyle as a young, unmarried woman who lived alone. And suddenly he had an idea. What if Molly had syphilis? Syphilis is a sexually transmitted infection that can cause painful ulcers and body aches. But Dr. Neff thought maybe it could cause other symptoms, like bone decay. He wanted to test Molly for syphilis, but in the 1920s, there was a huge stigma around syphilis in the United States. People who contracted the infection, especially unmarried women, were seen as dirty and immoral. The stigma was so severe that Dr. Neff didn't even want to bring up the possibility to Molly that she might have syphilis in fear of offending her. So he decided he would do the test secretly. The next time Molly visited his office, he told her he wanted to take a blood sample to test, but he didn't say why. And Molly, who was just so desperate to figure out what was going on with her, said that was fine. And so after she left and Dr. Neff had the blood sample, he tested it for syphilis. And sure enough, her blood came back positive for the infection. Finally, he had an answer for all of Molly's symptoms. However, it wasn't as simple as calling her back to the office and giving her medication, because at the time, there were no effective treatments for syphilis. Dr. Neff couldn't do anything to help her, and he figured if Molly knew she had syphilis, which was so stigmatized, she'd be overcome with shame. So Dr. Neff decided not to tell her or her family at all. Three months later, on September 12, 1922, Molly's older sister, Albina, came to visit Molly, who was now confined to a room at a boarding house. Albina tried to put on a brave face, but as soon as she walked inside, she was overcome with emotion, because her little sister barely even looked like a person anymore. She basically looked like a living skeleton. Molly had lost all of her teeth and her lower jaw, she could barely eat, and her body was basically wasting away. Her bones looked like they were trying to rip their way out of her skin. Albina looked into her little sister's eyes, and she could see that Molly was suffering. It was like she was trapped inside of this body that was just failing her, and nobody knew why, so nobody could help her. Albina sat down next to Molly and held her hand. She stared down at her sister's skinny fingers while she told Molly what was going on with their parents and their other sisters, and how much everybody loved her and missed her. And then, Albina heard a gurgling sound. She looked up and saw blood pouring from what was left of Molly's mouth. Albina jumped up and ran to find a doctor, but by the time she and the doctor got back, there was blood all over Molly, her eyes were glassy, and she wasn't breathing. She was dead. Albina just stood there, frozen in shock. Later, Molly's parents and other sisters joined Albina at the boarding house, where Dr. Neff would finally inform them that Molly had died of syphilis. Albina and the rest of her family couldn't believe it. 5 years later, on October 15, 1927, Albina, her sister's husbands, and her father went to the cemetery where Molly was buried. And Albina's stomach twisted with nerves, because they were not going there just to visit her little sister's grave. As they neared the cemetery, Albina saw a well-dressed group of men gathered by the entrance. She knew they were all doctors and lawyers who were there to witness the same thing that she and her family were. Albina, her relatives, and this big group of men walked through the cemetery gates past dozens of gravestones until they reached the spot where Molly was buried. And then, the men began to dig Molly up. Albina was terrified of what her sister's body might look like, but she knew exhuming Molly was necessary. Because in the years since Molly's death, dozens of women who worked at that watch painting studio had gotten sick with the exact same symptoms that Molly had. Several had become severely disfigured or died. And even though the owner of the studio insisted the women's health problems had nothing to do with their work, the women didn't believe it. It seemed impossible to deny that something in that studio was making them all sick. So, 5 of these women had banded together, lawyered up, and were attempting to sue the studio. But to make their case, they needed to prove a direct connection between the women's work and their illnesses. They hoped Molly's remains could give them that proof. Albina watched as the men used ropes and chains to lift Molly's coffin out of the ground. Once it was out, they slowly pried open the lid. And as soon as Albina saw her little sister's body, she gasped. Molly's skeleton was glowing. Molly's remains were brought to a medical examiner's office for an autopsy, and it was quickly determined that she did not die of syphilis. She'd never actually had syphilis at all. It turned out Dr. Neff had performed the syphilis test incorrectly and gotten a false positive result. However, the doctors and lawyers overseeing the autopsy had a hunch about what did kill Molly. It was the glow-in-the-dark paint that she and the other women at the studio used. They knew this paint contained a specific chemical element, which was what made it glow. The general public believed this element was safe. In fact, it was often prescribed as a medication, added to beauty products, and even put in toothpaste. Molly and the other women at the studio knew this element was in the paint, and they also knew they sometimes ingested a small amount of it during their workday. Because, as Molly was told during her onboarding, one of the big issues with the paintbrushes is the bristles would begin to flatten out over time. And so it was important, as a painter, to make sure the points on those brushes were sharp. And so the women had developed this technique called lip pointing, where they would take the paintbrush and they would put it in their mouth and tighten their lips around it to tighten the bristles, and then dip it in the paint and paint the watch. But each time they did that, there was always a little bit of the paint still on the brush that would go into their mouth and be ingested. Now, some women thought that maybe ingesting this element might be good for them, while others were a bit more hesitant and actually asked if the paint was safe, and their supervisors would always tell them that yes, it was. However, scientists and the owner of the studio knew that was not true. In reality, the element was extremely dangerous, and it was becoming increasingly obvious as more women from the watch painting studio became desperately ill. So, at this point, the doctors and lawyers wanted to prove that Molly's body contained a lethal amount of the element found in the paint. To do this, they performed a test that involved burning Molly's bones to ash, dissolving that ash in acid, and then checking for the element. And just as they'd thought, Molly's bones were full of radium. Radium is an incredibly toxic radioactive element. When it enters a person's body, it gradually destroys their bones and other tissues. In Molly's case, it caused her gums to swell, her teeth to fall out, and her jaw to fall off. Molly ultimately died because the radium poisoning ate through her jugular vein, which is one of the largest and most important veins in the body. This caused her to suddenly bleed to death. After it was proven that radium was killing the watch painters, the 5 women who filed the lawsuit all received settlement payments from their employer, the U.S. Radium Corporation. These included a lump sum plus an annual payment. However, these women did not really get to enjoy this settlement because eventually they all died of radium poisoning. Meanwhile, other similar studios continued operating in the United States. At least 50 women died as a direct result of radium exposure in these studios, including Catherine, the 15-year-old girl who had initially trained Molly and her sister, and Ella, Molly's friend who sat near her at the workbench, who showed her how she painted her nails with the radium. Eventually, another court case was filed, which led to better protections for people who worked with radioactive elements. However, by that point, it was already far too late for Molly and the other women who were unknowingly poisoned by their jobs, and who, to this day, still glow inside of their graves. Located in the far northwestern section of Canada is the aptly named Northwest Territories. It is a massive swath of land that virtually nobody lives inside of. To make that point crystal clear, consider the following. The country of Germany has a population of 83 million people, give or take. The Northwest Territories is 4 times as large as Germany, but only has a population of about 50,000 people. In addition to being this huge and mostly unoccupied space, the Northwest Territories are almost completely wild. Think dense forests, huge mountains, massive rivers and lakes, and lots of really big animals. Even for highly experienced outdoors men and women, the Northwest Territories can be a truly hazardous place. And within this truly hazardous place, there is one part that is the most hazardous, and it's right in the middle of the Northwest Territories. And it's this 11,000 square mile stretch of just pure wilderness that's called the Nahanni Valley. In 1976, the Nahanni Valley was made into a national park. But don't let that fool you. This is not some family park that anybody can go to. There are no tourist accommodations, so there's no hotels, there's really nothing inside of it. And there are no roads that lead into this park. The only way you can get inside this valley is by plane or by boat or by very stressful and difficult overland hike. But for those who are able and willing to make the effort to get inside of this valley, you have the opportunity to explore one of the most beautiful places on the planet, because this section of the world is almost completely untouched by man. It is really nature at its purest form. However, there's a catch. This valley is said to be haunted. Over the last 10,000 years, the handful of native tribes that have attempted to settle inside of the Nahanni Valley have all either suddenly disappeared without a trace, like the Naha tribe that literally overnight just was gone, leaving behind their shelters, their food, their supplies, just gone. No one knows what happened to them. Or the tribes have abruptly fled, claiming they were being terrorized or stalked by creatures lurking in the forest, like these white demons and these large wolves they called wahilas. Now, of course, this just sounds like folklore, and it might very well be that that's all it is, folklore. But starting in the early 1900s, some very strange things started happening in the Nahanni Valley that were not folklore. These things happened, and they were horrifying. These were horrifying, real events. And they might, depending on your viewpoint, give credit to some of the theories that the native tribespeople have about this valley, which is there's something evil lurking out in this forest, but we just don't know what it is. In 1904, three brothers, Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod, who all lived in the Northwest Territories, decided they wanted to go looking for gold in the Nahanni Valley. They figured because so few people had ever been inside of this valley, that if there was gold to be found, then certainly it had not been found yet. And so after a very long and arduous journey using sled dogs and trains and homemade boats, they finally slipped into the valley and found themselves on what's called the Flat River, which runs right through the center of the Nahanni Valley. Now, the Flat River is kind of ironically named because it's anything but flat. It's actually more like a rapid at certain points. But either way, the three brothers, they're on their boat, they're making their way up the Flat River, and at some point they pull off onto the riverbank and they set up camp. And then once their camp is set up, they go down to the river and they put their gold sluices in the water. A gold sluice is this long, skinny box that's usually made of wood, and it has a strainer on one side. And gold miners will put it in the water submerged, and they will kind of shovel the sediment on the bottom of the water into this little funnel, and the big stuff will get stopped by the strainer, and the dirt and the water will just kind of flow out the side. And so the idea is you can trap gold nuggets inside of this sluice. And so the three brothers, they get their sluices up and they start looking for gold, and right away they hit pay dirt. There is tons of gold in this river. And so all day, all night, they get all this gold. The next morning they do the same thing, and by the time all their containers are literally filled to the brim with gold, they decide, hey, let's go back and turn this in, get some money for it, and then come back out here. And so they pack up their tent, they pack up all their supplies, and they put everything back in their boat. They get out onto Flat River, and at some point very early on in their journey back, the boat capsizes, and the boat actually breaks apart from the strength of the rapids of Flat River. And so the boat actually just sinks, and much of their supplies sink, including all of their gold. But the three brothers are able to grab some of their supplies, like their rifle and some lumber and some of their mining supplies, and they swim it all to shore. They catch their breath. They're totally devastated at the loss of the gold, but they're alive. They have enough supplies to survive. And so they figure all they can do is maybe try to go back to their original site, try to get some more gold because they did still have a sluice, and then try to get out of there and then, regroup and come back another time. And so using some of the lumber they recovered from their broken boat, and then also by cutting down some trees, they literally fashioned another boat and then hopped back on the Flat River, and they went back up to that site where they had found gold earlier. They set up their sluice, they set up their camp again, and this time they didn't find any gold. So all day, this very disappointing day that they've already lost all their gold, now they're not finding any more gold. And so that night when they went to bed, they decided that the next day they were just going to leave. And so the next day they get up, they pack up, they hop back on the Flat River on this new boat they built, and they're able to make their way out of the valley and get back to their homes. As soon as they get back home, the two younger brothers, Willie and Frank, start talking about how they want to go back into Nahanni Valley and go get more gold, because now they know there's gold out there. It's not a question, yeah, we didn't find it that second time, but we know it's out there. Charlie, the older brother, he wanted to get the gold, but he felt like, hey, that was a close call with the boat flipping over. I don't know if it's a good idea, so I'm actually not going to go. You guys can go, I'm going to stay. And so several months goes by, and Frank and Willie have been doing all this preparation for this additional trip into the valley. And finally, in 1905, they're ready. And so Willie, Frank, and a third man called Robert Weir, who was a friend of theirs, he was going to replace Charlie. The three of them, they make their way up into the valley. Now, they didn't tell anyone how long they were going to be gone for, and so when they didn't send any word and no one had heard from them in weeks, Charlie was actually not that concerned because he knew there was lots of gold to be had out in the Nahanni Valley, and so he figured they must have struck it rich, and now they've decided to live out there long term, or at least maybe through the summer, or maybe the next year, and so he wasn't concerned, and because he wasn't concerned, nobody else was concerned about these three men. And so weeks turned into months, turned into a year, and still no one's heard from these three men. No one's heard from Willie, Frank, or from Robert, but still Charlie maintains that nothing can be wrong because there's three of them out there. They're incredibly experienced. There is a ton of gold out there. I'm sure they're just killing it and they're just acquiring all this gold, and we're going to see them in the next couple of months maybe, and everything's going to be just fine. But a whole other year would go by. So they've been out there for 2 years and no one has heard from them. And at this point, Charlie thinks to himself, okay, I have to go out and see if they're okay. And so he rounds up 4 other people from his town and he mounts an expedition to head back into the Nahanni Valley to go find his 2 brothers and find Robert Weir. Charlie and his search party eventually, after yet another long and arduous journey, they get into Nahanni Valley and they get onto the Flat River. And so they start making their way upstream along Flat River. So it must have been a very treacherous journey getting through the rapids of this river. And the whole time they're scanning the left and the right side, hoping to see some sign of life. They're looking for any indication that these 3 men are out here and just fine, but they didn't see any sign of them. And so they finally made their way all the way up to the very end of Flat River, or I should say the very beginning of Flat River, where it breaks off from a much larger river called the South Nahanni River. And once they turned onto the South Nahanni River, they began going downstream. And again, they're looking on either side for any sign of these 3 men. There's no sign of them. And then the river they're on takes a very sharp turn. It's actually called the Big Bend, and it's about a 45-degree turn. And as soon as you make that turn, it dumps you into this 10-mile stretch of river called Second Canyon. Now, along South Nahanni River, which is about 350 miles long, there are these 4 canyons that the water passes through. And they're labeled 4th Canyon, 3rd Canyon, 2nd Canyon, and 1st Canyon. And these canyons are massive. These sheer cliffs on either side of the river shoot up to 3,000 feet above the water, and in some parts, the water is actually just as deep, thousands of feet deep. And Second Canyon is unique because the cliff faces are as sheer as you're going to get, and the cliff faces almost butt up exactly up against the water. So there's really very little shoreline on either side. So once you're in this 10-mile stretch, you're basically boxed in. You have thousands of feet of water below you. You have these massive cliffs on either side, and there's really nowhere to go. You need to get through this section of the river before you can effectively get onto the shoreline and take a break from being in your boat. And along these cliffs are these openings you see high up all over the cliffs on both sides that are openings to these massive cave systems inside of these thousands of feet tall cliffs. And because of how difficult it is to not only get to Nahanni Valley, but also to get up to these different cave openings, nobody's gone inside of them. We don't know what's inside of these caves, save for the few that are down low enough that people can explore. So as you're passing through Second Canyon, it's almost like you're being watched because there's all these openings, but you can't see into them, and you're just forced to go down this 10-mile stretch, and you can't really go anywhere, and whatever's watching you, it's watching you. As soon as Charlie and his search party entered into Second Canyon, it would have immediately gotten darker, because that's another part of being in Second Canyon. These huge cliff walls of this canyon obscure the sunlight, and so they would have entered into this canyon, it would have gotten darker, and it's very windy inside of Second Canyon. So the winds would have picked up, so it's dark, very strange setting for them to be in, and they would have been looking on either side at these little strips of shoreline on either side, barely big enough for a boat to be. They would have been looking for any sign of life, safe, but they didn't see anything. As they're making their way down this 10-mile stretch, as they're getting closer and closer to actually entering into First Canyon, which is the next canyon you would enter into, the sides of the river start to get slightly larger where you could actually beach a boat. There's some trees, and on the left-hand side, right before exiting Second Canyon, they notice there is actually a tent perched within some trees. And so the search party naturally goes right over to the shoreline, they hop out, but as soon as they step foot on land and they have a clearer view of this tent and what's outside of it, they notice there is a body clearly lying on the ground outside of the tent. And so Charlie and the search party, they run over, and as soon as they're up close, they can tell this body is missing its head. And they see the clothes on this body are totally charred and burned, and whoever this was, they were reaching with their right arm when they died. And right outside of the reach of their right arm was a rifle that was propped up against a tree. And so they walk around this one body, and they go around towards the backside of the tent where the opening to this tent is, and they find another body, another very badly decomposed body, and it's positioned kind of halfway in the tent and halfway out of the tent. And there's a blanket kind of partially obscuring this person's body, and when they move the blanket, they see this body too is missing its head. So Charlie and the search party, they continue to search around the camp in hopes of finding the heads of these two people to try to figure out who they are, but they never find the heads. However, they do find some personal effects both in the pockets of these two bodies and then also inside the tent that would confirm these are Charlie's brothers. As for the third man that had been with them, Robert Weir, he was not at the campsite, and in fact he would never actually be found officially. However, a little ways down the river, another partial skeleton would be found several months later that was attributed to Robert. However, that was not 100% confirmed to be Robert. The only other interesting thing that was found at this campsite was a carving in a nearby tree, and it just said, "We have found a fine prospect," indicating that Charlie's brothers had found gold. But there was no gold either on them or in their camp or in the river nearby. Nothing. There was no gold. Charlie and his search party would leave the valley and get in touch with the mounted police, who would come out to the site where the brothers had been found. They would launch an investigation, and ultimately they would come to the conclusion that all three of these men, the two brothers and Robert, had starved to death, and then after they had perished, animals had taken them off, which is why Robert was found so far away and why the skulls were missing from the two brothers. Now, Charlie did not believe that. He believed they had been attacked by native tribes in the area, but the police were not buying that. They said this was a natural thing, this was an accident, and so that's that. When the story of these two decapitated men made the news, people went crazy about this. People were very divided about what they thought really happened. There was a percentage of people that believed that partial skeleton that was found, that was not Robert Weir. He had not died. He had murdered the two brothers, decapitated them, and then made off with their gold. The other percentage of people believed that all three men, the two brothers and Robert, had been attacked by a person, a group of people, an animal, a creature, something. There was some sort of attack, and that's why the two brothers were in those positions that indicated they had encountered something horrifying, with one brother reaching for the gun and the other appearing to have leapt from his bed before he ultimately died. But regardless of which side you fell on, pretty much everybody at the time who heard about the story became terrified of the Nahanni Valley. Specifically, they became terrified of that stretch in Second Canyon where the two brothers had been found. And so actually that stretch got renamed the Headless Valley, and from that point forward, that's all it was known as. And so even though there were obvious gold prospects in the Headless Valley and all along the South Nahanni River and the Flat River, people after this story broke were just not prepared to risk going in there and potentially becoming another victim. And so people kind of stayed away from Nahanni Valley. 8 years later, though, in 1913, a gold prospector named Martin Jorgensen decided, you know what, I'm not going to let some scary stories about some headless men and, ghosts and killers on the loose, I'm not going to let any of that get in the way of me taking gold out of Nahanni Valley. So all on his own, Martin makes the arduous trek inside of Nahanni Valley. He makes his way up Flat River, and he finally finds a spot about 70 miles upstream of where Headless Valley was, and he actually built a one-room cabin because he was going to stay there through the winter, and then the plan was he would meet up with his partners the following summer. And so right after he got there, he set up his sluices and he started mining for gold. And apparently he found a lot of it because he sent word back to his partners outside of the valley that he had made it rich. And so his partners were really excited to meet up with him the following summer and see how much he got because they planned on going back into the valley with him that summer. So that summer rolls around, his partners go to the meeting spot right outside the valley, but Martin doesn't show up. And so his partners, they stay outside at this meeting space for several days until finally, when he doesn't show up, they decide, we have to go in there and see if he is okay, because at this point he should have been here. There's no excuse. And so they end up going into the Nahanni Valley. They make their way up Flat River and they go roughly to the area where they knew he was staying based on the message he had sent earlier. He had described where he was staying and they actually found his cabin. Or I should say they found what was left of his cabin. His cabin had been completely torched, burned to the ground, and laying on the ground next to the burned out cabin was the burned out remains of another headless corpse. And this corpse belonged to Martin Jorgensen. The police did a thorough investigation, but they were never able to determine what actually killed him. The police did not connect Martin's death with the two McLeod brothers' deaths, even though they were all decapitated. They were in roughly the same area, and it happened within a few years of each other, and they looked very, very similar. Even though that all was true, the police said, nope, these are totally separate. Martin died for some reason, and then animals took parts of him away, and that's why his skull is missing. Martin's skull was never located, and the gold that Martin claimed to have struck it rich with was also not at the cabin, not on him. There was no gold anywhere in the vicinity. When Martin's death made the news, people went crazy, and despite the police assuring everyone that his death was not connected to the McLeod brothers' deaths, even though the police were saying that, the public didn't see it that way. It was just too easy to connect one decapitation with two other decapitations that have happened close together in a relatively short time frame, and so a lot of people assumed there must be a killer on the loose somewhere in Nahanni Valley. 7 years later, in 1921, the rumors of a killer on the loose were still alive and well when gold prospector John O'Brien and his partner decided, you know what, despite the rumors of this so-called killer or whatever's going on in the Nahanni Valley, let's go into the Nahanni Valley and try our hand. Let's try to get some gold. And so the two of them made their way into the valley and they set up camp in Headless Valley, not far from where the McLeod brothers had been found decapitated. So they set up their camp and they're there for a couple of days. They're doing well. They're finding gold. And then at some point, John tells his partner that he's going to go out and check all of their traps along the river. And he'll be back in about 8 or 9 days. And so his partner waits 8 or 9 days and John doesn't come back. And a couple of days after that goes by and now John's past due. And so the partner decides he has to go out looking for him. And so there was another gold prospector in the area. And so this partner contacted him and the two of them went to the river and began walking upstream until they found John. And he had frozen to death, but it was very interesting the way he was positioned. He was sitting in front of this obviously previously lit campfire. He wasn't hunched over. He didn't look like he was in pain. He looked like he was just enjoying the fire. There was nothing on his face that indicated discomfort or pain or fear. He was even holding the matchbook in his hand. It was like he was just sitting there enjoying the fire when something caused him to suddenly freeze. In fact, witnesses would say John looked like he had been flash frozen, as if it had happened in a matter of seconds, because it didn't look like he had reacted properly to freezing to death. And the police, when they came out, they would say, you know, this is odd. This is odd the way he's positioned. But ultimately, he died because he froze to death. And so there's no foul play here. And so no further investigation is needed. 5 years later, in 1926, a hunting party that included a young woman named Annie Lafferty was camping out along the Flat River inside of Headless Valley. And so that night, they're all kind of joking around the fire. And then at some point, they decide to all go to sleep. And then the next day, when everybody gets up, Annie is no longer in camp and there's no sign of where she went. And so they begin by yelling out and walking around the immediate vicinity to see maybe if she stepped away for a minute, but Annie's just gone and no one knows where she went. And so the hunting party spends the rest of the day looking for Annie, but there's no sign of her. They ultimately leave the valley. They tell police come out. There's this huge search, but Annie's never found. Several months later, a man named Charlie, who happened to have been out near Flat River, near this hunting party when they were out there, but Charlie himself was not in the hunting party. He didn't know Annie. He was just in the vicinity. He overheard someone talking about a member of that hunting party, specifically a woman, going missing. And when he heard that, he knew he had to tell police what he had seen that night out near Flat River. So he goes to police and he explains that that night when he knew there was this hunting party over there, he could hear them, he knew they were over there. He said at some point he went to bed and then he woke up when he heard the sound of rocks falling into the river in front of him. He was sleeping along the river's edge. So he sits up and he looks out across the river. It's totally dark, but there's some moonlight and he's kind of looking around wondering what's causing the sound, but he can't see it. And then he hears it again and he can tell it's off to his left. And these are not huge rocks. These are like medium to small size rocks, like rocks you could just pick up and throw. And so he's looking and all of a sudden he sees, maybe a couple hundred yards away through some sparse trees, he sees a naked woman, a white naked woman, running on all fours up this mountainside. And as she's running up the mountainside, her feet and her hands are knocking little rocks into the river down below. She's right on the edge of this cliff. And as she's running up this hill, she stops and she turns and he gets a good look at her face. And Charlie would say he was so taken aback by her face. It looked like she was possessed. There was something wrong with her face. And so Charlie instinctively ducked down and chose not to follow her, even though he knew anybody running naked anywhere in the wilds is doomed. But he felt like he could not go near this woman. There was something wrong with this woman. And so the police, they take this story down and they say, hey, this is what Annie looked like. And Charlie would say, I think that's her. I think that matches her description. And so universally, it's believed this woman galloping up this hillside in the middle of the night naked was Annie. The police ultimately would not investigate Annie's disappearance any further because at the time Charlie was telling them this piece of information, she had already been gone for months and the assumption was she was dead. 4 years later, in 1931, another gold prospector decides to try their luck in Headless Valley, a man named Phil Powers. He makes his way into the valley, he finds a spot off of Flat River, he builds a cabin, and then shortly thereafter, his cabin burns to the ground with him inside of it. Now, his skeleton was intact, but the strange thing about his death is based on the origin of the fire, which would have been on the roof. He should have had an opportunity to climb out of the cabin before it burned down, giving rise to the theory that he was actually dead before the fire started. However, the police said this was an accident caused by Phil doing something with the stovepipe that led to it catching on fire, and this was just all one big accident. But the vast majority of people that have followed along to this point with all of these strange deaths, they were just not buying it. 5 years later, in 1936, two more gold prospectors, William Epler and Joseph Mulholland, they entered the Headless Valley to try their luck, and shortly after arriving and getting set up, they went missing. A search party came out to look for them, and they found their cabin, and just like Phil Powers, it had burned to the ground, but William and Joseph were not in the ashes. They were not anywhere nearby. In fact, they were never found. No one has any idea what happened to them, and no one knows what caused the fire. 9 years later, in 1945, yet another gold prospector named Ernest Savard entered the Headless Valley to go looking for gold, and then when he did not leave the valley for an intended rendezvous with some of his partners went looking for him, and they would find him inside of his sleeping bag laying down, decapitated right along the Flat River inside of the Headless Valley. And so the police would come out, they would do an investigation, and they would call this an accident where, he starved to death or he died of hypothermia, and then after he was dead, animals must have come in and removed his skull, and that's why we can't find it. And so the police did not, at least not publicly, connect his death to all of the other decapitations in that small area. 1 year later, in 1946, another gold miner named John Patterson went into Headless Valley and he went missing. And so a search party went in looking for him, and John would never be found. But on one of the last nights that the search party was in the Headless Valley, they were camping out near Flat River, some native tribes people came into their camp and they warned them about some white figures that were walking around the valley that night. They're down near the river, they're out in the forest, they're kind of all around here, and so you really need to be careful. You don't want them to see you. And then these tribes people just left. And so the search party is absolutely horrified. They know about the rumors of this place. They're out here looking for someone that's gone missing in this place. And all night, all they hear are distant howls and screams that they hadn't heard in the previous nights. They're hearing these wailing sounds coming from all around them, like these things that are out there were intentionally trying to scare them to get them to leave. It felt like they were not supposed to be there. The next day, first thing when they got up and they left, the leader of that search party would say he just felt like the whole valley was totally sinister, and that constant wailing they heard the night before, he said he will never forget. From the mid-1940s onward, there have been far less strange incidents reported inside of Nahanni Valley, but one could attribute that to the fact that far less people have been going into Nahanni Valley ever since the 1940s. And in recent times, huge segments of the park have been permanently closed. The park has said the reason they're doing that is to protect that segment of the park, but other people have speculated that at least part of the reason why they're closing these segments, many of which are right near the Headless Valley, is because they're trying to protect people from getting anywhere near whatever it is that's lurking inside of that park. But regardless, it is still a fact that over the last century, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of people that have either gone missing or who have died under very mysterious circumstances inside of this valley. And the truth is, nobody knows why.